in a quiet town where nothing ever seemed to happen. There was a man no one feared, no criminal record, no violent past. Just a quiet neighbor, living alone. But behind closed doors, something was terribly wrong. When authorities finally stepped inside his home, what they discovered was so disturbing, it would change the definition of horror forever. This was not a monster hiding in the shadows. This was a man hiding in plain sight. How did a forgotten man from rural America become the inspiration behind some of the darkest horror films ever made? This is the real story of Ed Gein. Ed Gein was born in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, a rural area defined by isolation, farmland, and silence. To outsiders, it was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. But inside the Gein household, something was already deeply wrong. According to historical records and later psychiatric evaluations, Ed's childhood was dominated by fear, control, and emotional isolation. His mother, Augusta Gein, was a deeply religious woman who believed the modern world was sinful and corrupt. She preached that women, aside from herself, were immoral by nature, and that temptation existed everywhere. Ed grew up hearing these messages daily. As reported by court documents and later interviews cited by the Wisconsin State Journal, Augusta kept Ed and his older brother Henry socially isolated. The boys were discouraged from forming friendships, attending social events, or interacting with women outside the home. The farmhouse became Ed's entire world. School offered little relief. Teachers described Ed as quiet, withdrawn, and socially awkward. Classmates remembered him as polite but distant, a boy who rarely spoke unless spoken to. According to archived school reports, Ed struggled academically and showed signs of emotional detachment at an early age. At home, Augusta reinforced her worldview relentlessly. She read passages from the Bible that focused on punishment, sin, and death. She warned Ed that the outside world would destroy him. Over time, investigators believe these teachings blurred the line between fear, morality, and identity in Ed's mind. Psychologists later noted that Ed never developed normal social boundaries. He did not learn how to form relationships. He did not learn how to express emotion. And most importantly, he never learned how to separate fear from reality. In 1940, Ed's father died of heart failure, leaving Augusta as the unquestioned authority in the household. Ed became completely dependent on her, emotionally, socially, and psychologically. Then, in 1944, tragedy struck again. Ed's brother Henry died under suspicious circumstances during a brush fire near the family farm. According to official reports, Henry's body showed signs of head trauma, though his death was ultimately ruled accidental. No charges were ever filed, but the questions never fully disappeared. With Henry gone, Ed was alone with his mother. And when Augusta Gein died in 1945, Ed's world collapsed entirely. According to investigators, Ed sealed off most of the farmhouse, preserving his mother's bedroom exactly as it was, untouched, frozen in time. From that moment forward, Ed Gein lived alone, surrounded by silence, memory, and unresolved obsession. Neighbors described him as harmless, shy, childlike. No one suspected that beneath this quiet exterior, something was slowly beginning to take shape. Because the real story of Ed Gein did not begin with violence. It began with loneliness, and in the next section, we'll explore what happened after Augusta's death. How isolation turned into obsession, how curiosity crossed dangerous lines, and how a forgotten man in rural Wisconsin began a descent that would shock the entire nation. Ed Gein was not born a killer. To the outside world, he remained a quiet, unremarkable figure in the sparse countryside of Plainfield, Wisconsin. A hard, flat land where the wind spoke louder than its people, and the days crawled slowly under overcast skies. Encyclopedia Britannica. But the real story of Edward Theodore Gein, the man whose name would echo through crime history, did not begin with violence. It began with isolation. After the death of his father in 1940, Gein lived almost exclusively under the shadow of his domineering mother, Augusta, a woman whose influence shaped not just his beliefs, but his very identity. Northeastern Global News. Augusta Gein preached a rigid, fear-driven ideology. According to biographical accounts, she taught that the world was immoral, that temptation lurked around every corner, and that men and women were destined for certain paths defined by sin and virtue. Northeastern Global News. With each passing year in that lonely farmhouse, these lessons dug deeper into Ed's psyche, until the house itself seemed to become a prison where curiosity and fear fused into something much darker. When Augusta died in 1945, Ed's world abruptly changed. He sealed off her bedroom and refused to disturb its order, preserving every item exactly as she left it. What appeared to others as mourning was, in reality, something far more complex. An inability to move beyond the voice that had defined his entire existence. Northeastern Global News. In the years that followed, Gein's life became a series of ritualistic wanderings through memory and emptiness. While neighbors saw only a withdrawn man performing ordinary tasks, what went on inside that farmhouse foreshadowed something unsettling. Wikipedia. At first, his behaviors were subtle. He explored the overgrown cemetery paths near Plainfield at odd hours. He collected discarded objects from the fields behind his home. He studied the everyday tools of rural life with a fixation that seemed more intense than mere curiosity. Wikipedia. But slowly, minute by minute, Ed's fascination with death, once a distant concept, became a structure of his reality. What started as graveyard visits, at first rationalized as reflection, eventually turned into retrieval. He began to dig, and what he found changed not just his life, but the definition of horror itself. Wikipedia grave robbing was not a spontaneous act. It was a practice he approached methodically. According to historical court records, Gein would wait for quiet nights with no moonlight, walk through damp churchyard grounds, and carefully unearth the recently interred. He brought these bodies back to his farmhouse, where he examined them item by item, not for malice, but with a compulsion he could not explain and could never suppress. Wikipedia. To the casual observer, Ed remained merely peculiar. To Gore Vidal, a chronicler of American crime, he was a man whose appetites lay not in the world of the living, but in the artifacts of death. But it was within those artifacts that Gein's descent became unmistakable. ETV. Yet even as he stole bodies from their graves, Ed still lived a life that seemed ordinary from the outside. He did not hide from the public eye. He performed errands. He spoke with locals. He visited the hardware store, and he moved through town like a ghost with a purpose no one could see. Wikipedia. This duality, a man performing ordinary tasks during the day, yet walking among the dead at night, created a tension that would later become central to the case. It was as if Ed's interior world and exterior reality were separate universes, each with its own rules and dangers. And while neighbors continued their routines, following the predictable cadence of small-town life, the danger grew. Not ahead of them, but within the walls of that farmhouse. Gein's obsession was not random, it was systematic. Like many criminals whose minds break not suddenly but slowly, his behaviors took shape over years, built on a fragile foundation of grief, fear, and unexamined impulses. Wikipedia. By the mid-1950s, items in his home began to change. Furniture once crafted from wood became objects made from something else entirely, reflected in uncanny patterns, shapes that seemed to mimic human form but did not belong to any living person. These pieces were not merely trophies. They were artifacts of a fractured psyche. AETV. What happened inside that farmhouse puzzled even seasoned investigators. Law enforcement officials who later entered the home during the 1957 investigation recalled a scene that blurred the line between reality and macabre fantasy. A space transformed with objects that seemed to belong to neither the dead nor the living. Wisconsin Historical Society. Because Ed Gein had crossed the threshold from fascination to fixation, and in doing so had unwittingly created a legacy that would ripple far beyond his lifetime. By the time Ed Gein reached adulthood, the outside world felt completely foreign to him. According to records later examined by criminal psychologists, Ed had never learned how to function independently. His mother, Augusta Gein, had spent years reinforcing a single belief: that the world was corrupt, immoral, and dangerous, and that only she could protect him from it. Journalist Harold Schechter, who extensively researched the case, later wrote that Augusta's influence over Ed was absolute, unchallenged, and psychologically suffocating. Ed didn't just obey her. He depended on her. Neighbors in Plainfield recalled seeing the two together almost constantly. In interviews documented by Wisconsin newspapers, several residents described Augusta as dominating and intensely religious, while Ed remained silent, eyes lowered, standing just behind her, as if waiting for permission to exist. Inside their home, Augusta controlled everything: what Ed read, what he believed, who he spoke to. Psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland later noted that Ed showed signs of arrested emotional development, meaning his personality never fully matured beyond childhood. Then, in 1945, something happened that quietly changed everything. Augusta Gein died. Official records list the cause as a stroke. But for Ed, it wasn't just a loss. It was the collapse of the only structure he had ever known. Neighbors later told investigators that after his mother's death, Ed began sealing off rooms in the house. He preserved her bedroom exactly as it was, untouched, frozen in time. According to reports referenced in later court proceedings, Ed continued speaking about his mother in the present tense, as if she was still alive. Psychologists believe this was the moment Ed began losing the ability to separate fantasy from reality. Without Augusta's control, Ed didn't become free. He became untethered. Local shop owners noticed changes. He appeared more disorganized, more distant, sometimes smiling at inappropriate moments, yet no one considered him dangerous. He was polite, one neighbor later told investigators. Almost childlike. You'd never imagine he could hurt anyone. But beneath that harmless exterior, Ed's isolation deepened. According to psychiatric evaluations conducted after his arrest, Ed began retreating into obsessive thoughts, fueled by loneliness, unresolved trauma, and an inability to process grief. This was not a sudden transformation. It was a slow, psychological unraveling. And while the town of Plainfield saw only a quiet man struggling to cope, something far darker was quietly taking shape behind closed doors. Stories like this don't unfold all at once. They reveal themselves, piece by piece. If you want to understand how this quiet isolation turned into something far more disturbing, stay with us and follow LifeStories Archive for the full story. In the next section, we will explore how Ed Gein's inner world began crossing into reality, and how small, overlooked behaviors eventually led investigators to uncover one of the most disturbing cases in American history. After his mother's death, Ed Gein's life did not move forward. It folded inward. Plainfield continued as it always had. The same routines, the same faces, the same quiet rhythm of rural America. But inside the Gein farmhouse, time stopped functioning normally. According to later psychiatric evaluations conducted by the Wisconsin State Hospital, Ed displayed what clinicians described as emotional arrest, a state where grief does not process, but instead freezes the individual in a permanent psychological pause. Augusta Gein had not merely been a mother. She had been Ed's structure, his authority, his worldview, his moral compass. Without her voice dictating right and wrong, Ed was left alone with thoughts he had never learned to manage. Journalist Harold Schechter later wrote that Ed's post-1945 life resembled a man attempting adulthood without the emotional tools required to survive it. To the outside world, nothing seemed alarming. Ed still appeared in town. He still ran errands. He still accepted odd jobs. Neighbors remembered him as awkward but polite. He laughed too easily, apologized too often, avoided conflict at all costs. One resident later told investigators, "You never thought of Ed as dangerous. You thought of him as harmless, maybe even pitiful." That word, harmless, would later echo painfully through Plainfield. Inside the farmhouse, Ed made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He closed off his mother's bedroom. According to crime scene documentation photographed years later, the room remained perfectly preserved. Her bed neatly made, her clothing untouched, her belongings arranged with ritual-like precision. Psychologists later identified this behavior as pathological preservation, often associated with unresolved grief and emotional dependency. Ed was not remembering his mother. He was maintaining her presence. Meanwhile, the rest of the house deteriorated. Dust accumulated. Rooms went unused, corridors darkened. The contrast was stark. One room frozen in time, the rest slowly decaying. This environment became a physical reflection of Ed's mental state. According to forensic psychologists, isolation combined with preserved trauma can cause fantasy to become more emotionally satisfying than reality. And that is exactly what happened. Ed's days became repetitive. His nights became solitary. He spent hours alone reading magazines, newspapers, and second-hand books. Some were religious, some were medical, some were sensational crime stories, not obsessively, but continuously. Psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland later testified that repetition without external grounding can normalize extreme ideas over time. When no one challenges a thought, it doesn't disappear. It evolves. Ed began frequenting cemetery. Not during the day, not openly. At night, according to investigative reports, he targeted freshly buried graves. He did not vandalize them. He did not draw attention. He moved carefully, methodically. Psychiatrist Dr. James Reinhardt described this phase as a search for connection through proximity to death. Ed was not driven by rage. He was driven by absence. In public, he remained invisible. Shopkeepers remembered him as forgettable. Quiet, polite. He paid exact change. He avoided eye contact. He never lingered. One store clerk later said, "You forgot him the moment he walked out." That forgettability allowed Ed to exist without scrutiny. According to later psychological analysis, Ed's fantasies began to blur with memory during this period. He imagined conversations that never happened, relationships that never existed. This is a known symptom of extreme social isolation combined with developmental trauma. Ed had never formed adult relationships, never lived independently, never processed loss. His internal world began replacing the external one. And still, no one intervened. This is where many people misunderstand the Ed Gein case. They search for the moment he became dangerous, but investigators later agreed. The danger did not begin with violence. It began with unchecked isolation, with a man disappearing emotionally while remaining physically present, with a town mistaking silence for safety. Journalist accounts later revealed that Ed spent increasing amounts of time alone at the farmhouse, rarely venturing out except when necessary. According to psychiatric testimony, he experienced what is known as identity diffusion, a loss of clear self-definition. Without his mother, without social anchors, Ed no longer understood who he was supposed to be. Fantasy filled the gap, and fantasy, left alone long enough, demands expression. This was the psychological crossing point. Not an explosion, not a breakdown. A quiet shift. The line between thought and action did not shatter. It thinned. By the early 1950s, Ed Gein was no longer simply lonely. He was psychologically uncontained. And while Plainfield slept peacefully, believing the harmless man down the road posed no threat at all, the foundation for one of the most disturbing discoveries in American criminal history had already been laid. Understanding stories like this requires patience and respect for the complexity behind them. At LifeStories Archive, we don't rush the truth. We examine it carefully, piece by piece. In the next section, we will finally confront the moment when Ed Gein's private world collided with reality. The disappearances that shook Plainfield, the overlooked warning signs, and how investigators slowly realized they had misunderstood the man they thought they knew. For years, Plainfield looked exactly like any other rural American town. People woke up early, they worked the land. They greeted neighbors by name and locked their doors only out of habit, not fear. Ed Gein fit neatly into that picture. He was seen walking through town, running small errands, stopping briefly at local shops. According to residents interviewed years later by Wisconsin State Journal, he rarely spoke unless spoken to. And when he did, his voice was soft, almost apologetic. Nothing about him suggested danger, but normalcy has a way of hiding discomfort, especially in small towns where familiarity replaces curiosity. By the late 1940s, subtle changes began to register. Not alarms, not accusations, just moments that didn't quite sit right. Store owners noticed Ed lingering longer than necessary. Neighbors recalled conversations that ended abruptly, as if he had lost track of where he was. A former acquaintance later told investigators that Ed often seemed distracted, responding seconds too late, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Still, no one confronted him. In communities like Plainfield, silence is often mistaken for peace. Daily life moved on. Farmers gathered at auctions. Families attended church on Sundays. Children passed each other on dirt roads after school, and Ed remained on the margins of it all, close enough to observe, distant enough to remain unknown. According to archived county records and later psychological reviews presented during the investigation, Ed had grown increasingly isolated after his mother's death. Without her strict presence, his routines didn't expand. They collapsed inward. He stopped socializing almost entirely. Psychologist Dr. Harold Schechter, who later studied the case, noted that isolation can act as an amplifier, intensifying unresolved fears, fixations, and fantasies when left unchecked. In Ed's case, there was no external release, only repetition. The same roads, the same rooms, the same thoughts. Some townspeople began to notice the emptiness around him. At community gatherings, chairs beside him remained unoccupied. At local diners, people chose other tables, not out of fear, but out of instinct. One resident later admitted in an interview with Life magazine that Ed made people uneasy without ever doing anything wrong. That unease, however, never turned into action, and that was the danger. Because while the town remained busy, loud with movement, work, and routine, something else was happening quietly, unseen and uninterrupted. Ed Gein was slipping further inward. By the early 1950s, the separation between who he appeared to be and who he was becoming had grown dangerously wide. No crimes had been discovered, no reports filed, no suspicions formally raised, just a man fading into the background of everyday life. And history shows us something unsettling. The most dangerous moments are often not the loud ones, but the periods of calm that come before anyone realizes they should be afraid. In the next section, we'll examine how this silent isolation crossed into obsession, and how the first irreversible lines were quietly crossed while the town continued on, unaware. J. Warner Wallace, a former homicide detective who has spent decades analyzing cold cases, often emphasizes one critical point in the Ed Gein case. The most dangerous individuals are rarely the ones who stand out. According to Wallace's behavioral framework, Ed Gein fit what investigators later recognized as a low-visibility offender. He wasn't aggressive in public. He didn't seek confrontation. He blended into routine life so effectively that suspicion never formed. Wallace explains that Gein's ability to appear harmless allowed him to operate outside the mental threat radar of his community. In small towns, Wallace notes, familiarity often replaces vigilance, and Ed Gein benefited from that blind spot. Harold Schechter, one of the most respected true crime historians, has studied Ed Gein extensively and describes him not as a criminal mastermind, but as something far more disturbing. Schechter explains that Ed Gein represents a collapse of internal boundaries, not a calculated plan. According to Schechter's research, Gein lived in a psychological state where fantasy, memory, and reality slowly merged. After his mother's death, that separation weakened even further. Schechter has stated in interviews that Gein didn't enter madness suddenly. He drifted into it quietly. This gradual psychological erosion is what made him invisible. There was no single moment where alarms went off. Just a slow, internal unraveling that no one noticed until it was too late. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, a criminologist specializing in violent offenders, focuses on the environmental and emotional isolation surrounding Ed Gein. According to Dr. Yardley's analysis, Gein's life was defined by extreme emotional dependency, social deprivation, identity suppression. She explains that Gein never developed a stable adult identity. Instead, his sense of self remained frozen, shaped almost entirely by his mother's worldview. Dr. Yardley emphasizes that Ed Gein's actions cannot be understood through violence alone. They stemmed from a fractured sense of self, where control, preservation, and obsession replaced normal emotional processing. Her conclusion is chilling. Gein wasn't trying to shock the world. He was trying to stabilize his own. When you place these perspectives together, a clearer and more unsettling picture emerges. Ed Gein was not driven by rage in the traditional sense. He wasn't chasing notoriety. He wasn't performing for attention. Instead, experts agree he was withdrawing inward, slowly detaching from reality while appearing perfectly ordinary on the surface. And that is why his case continues to haunt criminal psychology today. Not because of what he did, but because of how quietly he became capable of it. For years, Ed Gein existed on the edges of Plainfield, unnoticed, unquestioned, and uninterrupted. But history shows us that silence never lasts forever. By the mid-1950s, something began to change. It didn't start with a body. It didn't start with a crime scene. It started with absence. On a quiet November evening in 1957, Bernice Warden, a respected hardware store owner in Plainfield, disappeared during business hours. Her truck was still outside, the store was open, but she was gone. According to county records, this immediately raised alarms. In a town where everyone knew everyone, people didn't simply vanish. Sheriff Art Schley was notified within hours, and almost immediately, investigators began retracing her last known interactions. Receipts were checked, witnesses were questioned, names were written down. One name stood out: Ed Gein. Store records showed that Ed had been in the shop earlier that day. Witnesses remembered him clearly, not because he acted suspiciously, but because he rarely came in alone. According to later police interviews, the memory struck investigators almost instinctively. Gein lived alone. He owned a truck, and he had been seen near the store shortly before Bernice disappeared. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to knock on a door. That knock would change American criminal history forever. When law enforcement arrived at Ed Gein's farmhouse on the outskirts of Plainfield, they weren't expecting what followed. This was not a raid. There were no flashing lights, no weapons drawn. Just officers stepping into a house they believed belonged to a harmless, socially awkward man. What they found inside defied comprehension. According to official police inventories and later court testimony, the interior of the farmhouse was filled with objects that should not exist, at least not together, and not in one place. Furniture crafted from human remains. Household items repurposed in ways no investigator had ever documented before. Remains preserved, altered, and arranged. Sheriff Schley later admitted that even seasoned officers struggled to remain composed. One deputy reportedly stepped outside to vomit. Another refused to re-enter the house. This was no longer a missing person case. This was something else entirely. Psychologists later described the scene as evidence of a private psychological world, a place where reality had collapsed inward and fantasy had taken control. According to Harold Schechter's research, Ed Gein did not view these objects as trophies in the traditional criminal sense. They were part of an internal narrative, a desperate attempt to reconstruct identity, control, and connection after years of isolation. As investigators catalogued the evidence, a horrifying realization set in. This wasn't recent behavior. It had been happening for years, and no one noticed. The town of Plainfield went silent. Neighbors who had once described Ed as odd but harmless were now forced to reconcile those memories with what law enforcement uncovered. J. Warner Wallace later explained that this moment represents one of the most dangerous failures in community awareness. When abnormal behavior becomes familiar, it stops feeling abnormal. Ed Gein had not hidden in darkness. He had hidden in routine. As news spread, reporters descended on Plainfield. National headlines followed. The story traveled fast, and with every detail released, the public struggled to process the scale of what had been discovered. But investigators weren't finished, because the farmhouse raised a far more disturbing question. If this was what Ed kept, what had he done to obtain it? Under questioning, Gein did not resist. According to interrogation transcripts, he spoke calmly, casually, as if describing everyday chores. He admitted to killing Bernice Worden. He also confessed to the earlier killing of tavern owner Mary Hogan, a cold case that suddenly made sense in light of the evidence. Yet even in confession, Gein showed little emotional response. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley later explained that this emotional flatness is often seen in individuals whose internal reality has replaced the external world. The crimes were not acts of rage. They were acts of preservation. Gein wasn't trying to shock. He was trying to maintain control over a world that had long slipped away from him. By the time the investigation concluded, Ed Gein was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and committed to a state psychiatric hospital. But the damage was already done. The case would inspire decades of horror films, novels, and cultural myths, many exaggerating, sensationalizing, and distorting the truth. Yet the real story is far more unsettling than fiction. Because Ed Gein was not a monster hiding in shadows, he was a man hiding in plain sight. By the mid-1950s, something in Plainfield had changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, but enough for people to feel it. Routines continued, shops opened, buses arrived, neighbors waved. Yet conversations lingered a little longer, and silences grew heavier than before. People began to notice patterns. Ed Gein was still polite, still quiet, still helpful. But he was also everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. According to crime historian Harold Schechter, what made Ed Gein unsettling was not aggression, but absence. An emotional blankness that allowed him to drift beneath suspicion for years. Locals later told investigators that Ed seemed detached from normal cause and effect. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he reacted. Former acquaintances recalled that when tragedy struck the town, illness, accidents, sudden deaths, Ed never appeared shocked, not curious, not afraid, just unchanged. Criminal profiler Dr. Elizabeth Yardley explains that this emotional flatness is often misunderstood as harmlessness. In reality, it can indicate a person who has stopped responding to moral boundaries the way others do. And slowly, Plainfield began to sense it. People noticed Ed lingering longer than necessary, standing where he didn't belong, asking questions that felt slightly off. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious, just enough to make people uncomfortable, and then immediately dismiss that discomfort. Because who suspects the quiet man? Former neighbors later admitted something chilling. We didn't think he was dangerous. We thought he was lonely. But loneliness can hide obsession, and obsession, when left unchecked, doesn't disappear. It deepens. Former Detective J. Warner Wallace has often said that crimes like these don't begin with violence. They begin with isolation that goes unnoticed and warning signs that feel too small to confront. In Plainfield, those signs were everywhere. They were just never put together. Until one disappearance made it impossible to ignore. A woman vanished. Then another name entered quiet conversations. And suddenly, Ed Gein was no longer just the man people felt uneasy around. He was the man people started to remember. And once memory catches up, the truth is never far behind. What investigators would soon uncover would not only shock Plainfield, it would force the entire country to confront a kind of horror no one wanted to believe existed. Because the most terrifying truth was this: Ed Gein didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone you'd already passed on the street. By November 1957, the unease in Plainfield was no longer subtle. It had a name, a face, and a growing list of unanswered questions. When local hardware store owner Bernice Worden failed to return home one evening, concern spread quickly. She was reliable, predictable, the kind of person whose absence meant something was wrong. Her truck was still parked behind the store, the cash register was open, and there were signs of a struggle. This time, the town didn't wait. Investigators began retracing her final hours, and one detail stood out immediately. Earlier that day, Bernice had spoken to a familiar customer, a quiet man, polite, soft-spoken, Ed Gein. According to police records, Ed was the last known person to see her alive. For the first time, suspicion had a direction. When officers arrived at Gein's farmhouse outside Plainfield, they expected resistance, or fear, or denial. Instead, they were met with calm. Ed answered questions without hesitation, without emotion, without visible concern. And when authorities finally stepped inside his home, what they discovered would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. Veteran investigators later admitted they were unprepared. Not for violence, but for normalization. Furniture made from human remains. Objects repurposed in ways that defied comprehension. Evidence of obsession preserved with care rather than chaos. Crime author Harold Schechter later described the scene as not rage-driven, but ritualistic. There was no frenzy, no panic, only intention. According to forensic psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, the lack of emotional urgency at the scene suggested something far more disturbing than impulsive violence. It suggested comfort. Ed Gein was not reacting to what he had done. He had been living with it. As evidence mounted, Plainfield shut down. Neighbors gathered in disbelief. Some cried. Some refused to look. Others simply stood in silence, replaying every memory they had of the man they thought they knew. Former Detective J. Warner Wallace later noted that cases like this fracture communities because they force people to question their own instincts. How did we miss this? Why didn't we see it? The truth was painful, because Ed Gein never hid behind intimidation. He hid behind familiarity, and when he was finally taken into custody, there was no dramatic outburst, no confession filled with emotion, only quiet compliance, as if the world had finally caught up to something he'd accepted long ago. But the story was far from over, because what investigators uncovered inside that farmhouse would ripple far beyond Plainfield, inspiring decades of horror, fiction, film, and myth. Yet the real horror wasn't cinematic. It was human, and it was real.